What if I told you that the most common cause of a heart attack wasn't really a blockage in the artery? Join me as I speak with Dr. Stephen Hussey, who, after being diagnosed with type 1 diabetes and realizing his increased risk for heart disease, dug in to determine what are the real factors that cause heart attacks. Thank you for joining us today on another episode of Hunger Hunt Feast. With me is my guest, Stephen Hussey, who is has a doctorate in chiropractic medicine, but is also a master's degree in human nutrition and functional medicine. Thanks for joining me today, Stephen.
It's great to be here. Thanks for the invite.
And also author of The Health Evolution. I know you're working on a second book regarding heart health. Is that correct?
Right. Yeah, exactly. It's in the editing process right now. So.
Oh, awesome. That's exciting and frustrating at the same time, I know.
Yeah, definitely.
So you're a chiropractor, you have obviously, as well as a lot of education, nutrition, but your focus from looking at what you post has been primarily on heart health, which is an unusual focus for a chiropractor and even a nutritionist. So what has led you to this focus? Like, why is that something you're doing such a deep dive on?
For sure. And it's a good place to start too, because just people will get to know a little bit about me, but also sometimes people don't want to hear this kind of stuff from a chiropractor, someone who's not a quote unquote specialist in heart health,
Right.
But I think that, my story is that from a very young age, I was diagnosed with all these inflammatory conditions. I
Hmm.
had asthma. I had irritable bowel syndrome. I used to just break out in chronic hives all over my body, just huge hives.
Wow.
I had interesting allergies and all kinds of inflammatory things. And that ultimately ended up as autoimmune type 1 diabetes when I was 9 years old, which is just the result of, leaky gut, inflammatory kind of thing. My body attacked itself. And attacked the cells that make insulin in my pancreas. And so now my body doesn't make insulin and I'm type 1 diabetic. And so from that point on, my parents and I were kind of, very reliant on the Western medical system
Mhm.
to take care of me and to figure things out, even though prior to that, they had never really given us an answer as to why I had all these inflammatory conditions. And
Hmm.
so, since type 1 diabetes predisposes me to heart disease quite significantly, I would used to go into endocrinologist's office and there was all these posters on the wall that as I became more astute as I grew up, I saw, oh, type 1 diabetics are more prone to heart disease and artery disease. They can have, limbs amputated or damage to the arteries of their eyes and all this kind of stuff. So they lose their vision. And I was just like, oh my God. And so I've kind of made it a little bit of a personal mission to figure out how I can prevent this disease that I'm supposedly predisposed to. And throughout my medical training and my nutritional training, and just through all my own personal research, I found a lot of things that contradicted what I was being told about all kinds of things about the heart. And so it was only about maybe 2 years ago, maybe a little less than that, that I started sharing my findings through social media and my blog and things like that. And people enjoyed it. So I kept doing it. And here we are.
Gotcha. So, in a sense, driven by your own need to
Mhm.
know more, which I think more of us should be self-educating based on
Yeah.
our
Yeah.
our own health. But that's fantastic. You're able to share that through personal experience and citizen scientist to a degree. Although you certainly have training education, far more in nutrition than the vast majority of doctors, certainly more than they get in med
Right.
school, unless they've pursued it on their own. Um, so is that what this second book is about then? The focus
Yeah.
on the
So,
heart.
like in my first book, I discussed kind of a bird's eye view explanation of why we have chronic disease from an evolutionary perspective. And so one of the most common questions I would get was, okay, well, how do these mismatches between our current environment um, and our evolved physiology result in chronic diseases that we see today? And so I was like, well, it'd be kind of daunting to discuss that about all chronic diseases,
Mm,
even though I think they're all pretty much caused by the same underlying things. But since I had this interest in heart disease and always looked in that, I figured, well, I'll just write a book that it kind of relates that first book to, like, the principles from that first book to heart disease, and explains everything I've found about the heart and why we have heart disease.
I see. Well, it's the number one killer of humans.
Right.
So, I
Yeah.
mean, why not start with the big one?
Yeah.
Uh, you know, and gets most of us younger than most of us are going to face um, that concern if it's a risk for heart disease earlier in life than, say,
Mm.
cancer or dementia and
Right.
so forth.
Hmm.
So let's start unpacking this. What did you? I mean, did you ever discover the source of all of your inflammation?
Um, I mean, it wasn't one thing.
Okay.
It was many different things, which is it is for most people. I think that
Hmm.
a very important take home is that disease is usually multifactorial
Sure.
for people. There's lots of different things that our bodies come in contact with every single day, and in a sense, it the one thing I've kind of thought about that is that, in a sense, our medical research is fundamentally flawed in that way, in that it's trying to exclude all the variables and see if
Mm.
one thing causes disease, when that's not the reality for humans. We are exposed to multiple things every single day, multiple things that can cause harm to our bodies. But when I look back at my childhood, yeah, I was definitely eating the standard American diet, which was full
Mm.
of processed grains and sugars and vegetable oils. I was, exposed to many toxins that I choose to exclude now, everything from sunscreens to artificial fragrances, to plastics, all that kind of stuff. But I was also a very anxious child. When I think back to how I felt then, I was definitely more, I guess, shy, and social situations stressed me out a
Mm.
lot when I was forced into those, just kind of tagging along with my parents or whatever. And I just didn't like them. And so I think that could have played a role in inflammation, just being an imbalance in my autonomic nervous system. But yeah, I think that's common for a lot of kids these days. But yeah, I think that it was a lot of different things. But um, I think that diet was probably the biggest thing, just because that's something you eat every single day. I don't know that I was exposed to those toxins every single day,
Hmm.
but I was definitely exposed to toxins in food and ate poor food every single day when I was a kid. So that was probably the biggest thing.
Gotcha. Okay. Well, what have you found to be the factors? As you said, they're multifactorial, so we can just unpack them.
Yeah.
Um, for the heart disease, because
Yeah.
obviously your primary, I guess, search was, you've got type 1 diabetes. How do I reduce my other risks?
Mm.
I would imagine, because that's one you can't really
Yeah.
do much about.
I'll never, have um, the blood sugars of an insulin sensitive, normal person.
Mhm.
They'll never be where they should be for like them, for me.
Mhm.
But yeah, I mean, if we want to talk about, I mean, there's three kind of, I guess, families of heart disease. There's heart failure,
Mhm.
there's, myocardial infarction or heart attacks, ischemia, that kind of stuff,
Mhm.
and then there's atherosclerosis. I think the one most commonly talked about is atherosclerosis.
Right.
Everybody wants to talk about what causes that, and so if you ask me what causes atherosclerosis, I think that it has very little or any, if anything, to do with LDL or cholesterol or any
Mhm.
lipoprotein. And it has more to do with damage to the lining of our arteries from various things. And those things could be the toxins I was talking about earlier. So things like heavy metals or plastics, or all the artificial fragrances, just all the synthetic things that have come into our environments over the last, 50, 60, 70 years, that our bodies had never been exposed to before.
Mhm.
So those things, also elevated blood sugars, will lead to what's called advanced glycation end products, which basically just means it's a molecule that's damaged by glucose because there's too much sugar around, or glucose or proteins are damaged in food as we cook them or heat them or something like that, and we can eat advanced glycation end products as well. So how we cook things, but also endotoxins. So endotoxins are gram-negative bacteria that end up in our bloodstream. And so they can end up in our bloodstream because they leak from somewhere, usually from if someone has a leaky gut. Those bacteria, the microbiome in the gut can leak into the bloodstream when it's not supposed to. Or if we have poor dental health, and various forms of poor dental health, that can cause bacteria from our mouth to leak into the bloodstream as well. So endotoxins will do that. And then I think that the inflammation from lots of processed foods, so grains and sugars, seem to be pretty inflammatory. But I think worst of all is the vegetable oils like canola and corn and soy.
Right.
There's no vegetable in that, so I don't know why they call them vegetable oils, but
To sell them.
yeah, I guess so.
Yeah.
But those are very easily damaged oils, and so most of the time they're even damaged before we even intake them into our bodies,
For
because
sure.
they've been exposed to heat and light throughout the process of making them. But those are polyunsaturated fats that are very unstable, and they become damaged. And all these things combined lead to what's called oxidative stress in our body. And that oxidative stress is what initiates the damage to the lining of our arteries as our body is trying to, flush all these toxins and things out of our body through our bloodstream. And that damage is what triggers the body to try and repair that damage with whatever it has available, which is usually some minerals and forms of cholesterol that it can use almost as like spackle to go in there and patch it up. And so that's what we see deposited in the arteries. And that gets blamed when in reality it was all the things causing this inflammation and oxidative stress that caused the whole situation. And there's even interesting theories about how it doesn't really start on the lining of the artery. It actually comes from the arteries that supply the arteries, because even our arteries need a blood supply. So there's lots of different interesting things, but no matter the mechanism of how it actually plays out and how it actually forms or gets stuck in the lining of an artery, the thing that initiates the whole process is this oxidative stress from all these things that our body shouldn't be exposed to.
Right. Right. Well, and like you said, we tend to do that every day, depending on your diet. We have constant exposure to that, or the chance for constant exposure. So it's not, as you mentioned, not the LDL. It's certainly not the saturated fat. If it's not LDL, then we're not worried about fat. We're worried about, like you said, the seed oils, because they are so oxidative. Can you explain that a little bit for people? Do you mind? I know that's not like the primary focus of your book and a lot of what you talk about. Could you mind unpacking a little bit of the dangers of the seed oils and vegetable oils a little bit, as far as what that means, as far as for people listening to the oxidative stress and what that does?
Yeah. So oxidative stress is like, I'll start with explaining that, and then I'll go into why seed oils are a problem. But
okay,
oxidative stress is, if we think of things that become damaged when they're exposed to oxygen, like iron rusts, or bronze turns green, like the Statue of Liberty is green, that kind of stuff. And so these things have become oxidized. And usually what that means is that electrons are changing places. Okay, so we have a molecule, and most molecules in our body like to be stable and paired, and to have equal amount of electrons on them. But sometimes we can get molecules in our body, or our body actually makes some of these molecules that are unstable. They only have one of these electrons. And I tell people that they're kind of like the Looney Tunes Tasmanian devil, and they're going around in a circle trying to find another electron, and they're going to destroy or steal that electron from anywhere to get it, and they're just desperate for it. And so they'll steal it from another tissue that is stable. And so that could be from our mitochondria, it could be from the lining of an artery, it could be from anywhere. And so that causes damage, because when you steal that electron, it creates another free radical where that tissue was. By stealing that electron, now it doesn't have a stable. So this is kind of like a chain reaction process. And we have systems in our body that make what are called antioxidants. And that is supposed to mitigate the damage from some of these free radicals, because no matter what we do, just the very process of making energy gives us free radicals. And so we have the system that also makes antioxidants in our liver, glutathione and superoxide dismutase, that are supposed to take care of those free radicals. And people think that consuming lots of antioxidants in food will also do this, but from what I've seen, the research doesn't really show that that's the case. Doesn't mean that they're harmful, I don't think, but it doesn't really show that it reduces our levels of oxidative stress when we consume foods with all these antioxidants. So I don't
Wow,
know.
there's
I
a
think that,
shocker. Oh, wow. Okay, so you're
yeah,
saying that
yeah.
eating foods high in vitamin C and resveratrol and all of these other
Hmm.
antioxidant micronutrients really don't help us much when it comes to oxidative
I
stress
I
or
think the jury's
endotoxins.
out. I don't think that's really been
Okay.
tested. But
Okay.
I do know there are studies that show that when people increase that directly measure oxidative stress when they increase their fruit and vegetable intake,
Hmm.
it had no effect on their oxidative stress or their inflammation or any of that stuff. Um,
Wow.
Right. And then there's other studies that show that when we eat foods that help stimulate the production of our own antioxidants, like glutathione and things, that we do see a reduction. So I think it's, for me right now, as far as what I know in the research, that it's about eating those foods that stimulate the production of my glutathione, which are things like sulfur and amino acids. But a specific array of amino acids. So we want to get like collagen proteins, which are very good. They have the glycine
Hmm.
in them. So that's one of the three that make up glutathione, and we rarely get that one in our diet. So we want to get that one from connective tissue proteins and things. And
Hmm.
so I think that has been shown to reduce oxidative stress in the body. So yeah. Anyways, the body is constantly trying to equal out this oxidative stress, or these free radicals that are created, these molecules with an unpaired electron. And so but other things can act as free radicals too. It's all the things that I just mentioned, as far as the heavy metals and the toxins and the endotoxins, like endotoxemia, and then the vegetable oils, um, all those things, or advanced glycation end products, those things all can act like free radicals. They can cause damage, or they can create a situation that results in more free radicals. Because, like, BPA is the plasticizer in plastic, is not necessarily a free radical. It's not an oxidant, but it seems to create more free radicals in the body when it's around. So it tends to
Right.
create a situation where we have oxidative stress. Um, and so with vegetable oils, so if we look at the difference between a saturated and an unsaturated fat, so there's saturated fats, you have this little fatty molecule, and then it has this long chain of carbons. And in the saturated fat, all those carbons are saturated, quote unquote, with hydrogens. So they're full of hydrogens, and they can bond with no more hydrogens. Okay.
Hmm. Right.
Whereas with an unsaturated fat, you have a double bond between two of the carbons. And so it's not saturated. It doesn't have as many hydrogens as it could. And so because of that, it's more vulnerable to damage when we have things like heat or free radicals or light that they're exposed to. They can become damaged. We can get kind of almost like kinks in these. And so
Hmm.
we have fats like monounsaturated fats, which olive oils and avocado oils are said to have more of. And so those have one opportunity to get damaged as far as that carbon chain. And then we have the polyunsaturated fats, which have multiple double bonds along the carbons. So there's a much higher chance that they get damaged. And when those things get damaged, they cause all kinds of issues because they become a free radical. Um,
Right.
and the body can't use those fatty acids as well. And so that's that's why vegetable oils are such a problem. But they're also a problem in a lot of other ways. If you want me to talk about those too.
Sure. Sure.
Yeah.
I
So
think they're
so
evil, and
vegetable,
not enough information is known about them. And that
right.
every restaurant that anyone goes to is using them to cook their food.
Mm-hmm.
So they say, well, I don't have cooking oils in my house right now. I just use olive oil or butter. But if they go out to a restaurant, that's what their food was fried in, cooked in some way. They've used vegetable oils and they're
Right.
taking it in. So let's unpack it. Keep going. Yeah.
Yeah. So um, I think that they're very, evolutionary inconsistent. Like we never would have had a vegetable oil
Oh no.
ever. And so it makes sense that they cause all these problems.
Right.
But one of the other problems is that it seems to be that whenever whenever we eat vegetable oils, because when our body's using those polyunsaturated fats to make energy from them, it's burning those for fuel.
Right.
It seems to be that it creates a different ratio of, this is a little bit technical, you don't have to know all this stuff, but like it creates a different ratio of NADH to FADH when we're making the energy. And that ratio is what signals our fat cells to be insulin resistant or insulin sensitive.
Hmm.
Okay. And so we want our fat cells to be insulin resistant
Right.
because it sounds like a bad thing, but we don't want them always taking up energy and storing energy in their fat cells, right? But when our fat cells are insulin resistant, the rest of our body is very insulin sensitive. And that's what we want, right? And so these vegetable oils seem to be the thing that change that ratio and trigger the process the wrong way. And they create kind of systemic insulin resistance because they're making our fat cells very insulin sensitive. And that's going to cause us to put weight on because when our fat cells are insulin sensitive, they're going to take up energy and they're going to store energy. Okay,
I see.
so that's one issue. Another issue is that
So essentially, so let me let me make sure I interpret this correctly. What you're saying is, when our body is processing these vegetable oils as energy, rather than actually giving us energy or turning it into ATP or cellular energy, it's diverting a lot of it towards fat storage instead of.
No, so it is turning them into energy. It is using them to make ATP, but during that process, there's certain molecules that are made that are all like, passing electrons along and switching around electrons.
Okay.
One of those is FADH, the other is NADH, and so that ratio is what sends out a signal to the rest of our body, to our fat cells, to be insulin sensitive or insulin resistant. And so when we burn these unsaturated fats, we're telling our fat cells to be insulin sensitive. And so then any energy that's floating around in the bloodstream or wherever, fat cells are taking that in because insulin's telling them to take it in. And so we're storing fat.
So it triggers a fat storage.
Right.
Action.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
It'll also make some ATP because the body has to have that.
Sure.
But it's also creating a situation where down the line, we're going to have weight gain and insulin resistance body-wide because our fat cells are very insulin sensitive. The body is very insulin resistant.
I see.
Which we don't want. We don't want that situation. We want the opposite.
Right.
And so with saturated fats, it seems to do the opposite. So that's what we want to be eating, in my opinion. So yeah.
Gotcha.
Also, these vegetable oils. Well, one thing is that they've shown to be contaminated with mercury, which mercury is one of those things because during the process of making them, I think that they have to use some chemical because that's not a natural thing for oil to come out of a corn or oil to come out of anything really. You have to kind of process it to get it out of there. Same with corn syrup. To make that kind of stuff, you have to use these chemicals. So that's been shown to be contaminated with that, which is probably oxidizing it in the bottle before you even eat it.
Correct.
Or damaging it. And so the other thing is this idea of plant fat versus animal fat. So animal fat is, cholesterol. Plant fat is phytosterol. Two very different fats. So phytosterol seems to be perfect for the physiology of a plant, and cholesterol seems to be perfect for the physiology of animals, and humans are animals. And so when you think about which one I want to eat more of, it's definitely going to be cholesterol. So there's interesting studies that don't necessarily, again, I think the jury is still out on this as well, but there's interesting studies that compare, or that they add phytosterol to the diets of rats and mice. And then there was one actually done in humans where it was just kind of these people were already scheduled for a heart valve replacement. And so what they did before the replacement is they did like interviews where they asked them about their diet and tried to get a sense of how much vegetable oil or how much plant fat they were eating, how much phytosterols they were eating. And there was a direct correlation between how much phytosterol they found deposited in arteries or around the valve they were replacing and how much they ate in their diet.
Wow.
And so that includes, coconut oil and olive oil and avocado oil. Those are phytosterols. Those are plant fats. I'm not going to sit here and say that those are bad foods for everyone.
Right.
They're definitely better than vegetable oils for sure. But I do think that the main fat we're designed to eat is animal fat, because we don't see those things. Now, the other experiments have all been done in rats and mice, and so we can't really say that that's going to happen in humans. We don't know, but they're interesting. I mean, when they fed this one group of rats, they fed them. These were rats that had been bred in the lab to be predisposed to stroke. And so when they fed them, a saturated fat versus a corn oil and a olive oil diet, or diets supplemented with those things, the olive oil and corn oil groups did way worse as far as they died of strokes way earlier. And so the animal fat group, so like I think the last rat to die in the olive oil and corn oil groups was around day 100, but the last rat to die in the animal food was like a day 250 or something like that.
Okay.
So they lived a lot longer. So just some interesting things there, but and so I think that it all points to the fact that I don't think that we could never eat that we should never eat some plant fats, but it should definitely never be in the form of vegetable oils. And if you look at the amount of vegetable oils that we're eating as a society, it makes sense that we're seeing all this increase in oxidative stress and strokes and all kinds of stuff. And so yeah, people can kind of take that information and do what they want with it. But to me, it's definitely going to be a heavy animal fat diet.
Right. So looking at someone wanting to shift away from cooking, or they would move towards cooking with, say, beef tallow, lard, bacon fat, things like this, butter, more traditional fat, which I believe is what, I mean, I know such a big deal has been made about the Mediterranean diet, but olive oil has really only been used for cooking for about 150 years there. Prior to that, it was lard. We know France, butter and lard, they're big on butter. So I think when we really look at looking back, ancestrally, that has been what we've been used for cooking. We've been using for cooking for as long as we've been cooking. Really, is taking the fat of animals. Whereas the original, I think, you look at 100 years ago, 150 years ago, when the cardiovascular disease started showing up, really 100 years ago, we had just had the Crisco oil produced, the cottonseed oil, Crisco cooking, whatever you want to call that, like lard type substance, but it had originally been used for a lubricant.
Right.
And when we find, what gets me is we take, there's people taking these used oils or old vegetable oils from restaurants and using them for biodiesel. So this stuff ignites.
Exactly.
I mean, it can be burned in an engine, and so in an explosive way. I mean, it's not burning for fuel the way we take it chemically, but it's a combustible.
And so people don't know that. So if we do want to talk about studies in humans, back when Ansel Keys in the 1950s came out with his diet heart hypothesis that saturated fat and cholesterol caused heart disease, that was never really tested clinically. Well, it was tested clinically, and that's what I'm about to talk about. So they actually did a lot of studies that tried to show this, that tried to prove this, and there was one in Australia called the Sydney Diet Heart Study, like that.
Right.
There was one in Finland. There's one in Norway. There's one in the U.S. Up in Minnesota, which Ansel Keys was, one of the researchers on.
Right.
And they
the
all
Minnesota
tried to,
heart study. Yes.
Yeah. And so they all tried to show that they just basically, fed people more saturated fat or more phytosterol, more unsaturated fats, more vegetable oils.
Yeah.
I think they used a lot of margarine in those studies.
Margarine and corn oils. It was all linoleic acids.
Yeah.
So yes.
Yeah. And they found exactly the opposite of what they were trying to find. They found that the more vegetable oils people ate, the higher mortality was from all things, not just heart disease.
All-cause mortality. Right.
Yeah.
You're right.
And the crazy thing is that lots of those, or some of the data and even the whole studies weren't even published. because they didn't even find what they wanted to, and that it wasn't published until one of them, I think the Sydney one wasn't published until like 16 years later, when someone went back and dug up the information and then published it. And even then, they published it in like a small journal where like they felt nobody would read it, you know.
Sure.
And it was just like clearly that when they tested the hypothesis, it did not work out. But you know, they'd already gone forward with the theory as far as all the recommendations, and there was all this money backing it, and they couldn't go back on it now. And that's how we are where we are today, where people are terrified of saturated fat and think that margarine is better for you.
Right. It's really scary how that was all shoved down our throat, so to speak, and turned into a marketing campaign before even before the research was done. And now that the research is done, we can't unscramble the egg, so to speak. We can't we can't take all that. It's hard for them to take it all back, and it's gonna be up to really the grassroots effort of people who don't have millions and hundreds of millions invested in that dogma, but we're willing to say, hey, this is what will help us, but this is what's killing us. This is what's been killing us for 40 or 50 years. So let's change the dialogue, change the paradigm on us. Well, I know that isn't the extent of your research wasn't all in fat. So I mean, you've done quite a bit in as far as you mentioned toxins. I think there's also the stress, autonomic nervous system, HPA excess. So help take us through that, because I think that is not discussed enough. With we're all focused on food, but we don't really address, unless you're talking about autoimmune, we really rarely hear much about HPA excess in the autoimmune system.
So I think that there's a reason, just to kind of start this off, there's a reason that we say things like, I love you with all my heart, or I gave that all my heart, because there's this actually, it's a very well ingrained, but also anatomically ingrained emotional connection to this organ, to our heart. It's how we feel our feelings, and also the gut. We have gut feelings about things and things like that. We say that kind of stuff. And so if you look at those two organs, they are the two most innervated, or they have the two most nerve connections to the vagus nerve, which is the nerve of our autonomic nervous system. And so our autonomic nervous system is the system in our body that is perceiving our environment through our five senses and sending signals to our brain that tell us if we're in a safe or a threatening environment. And so if we're perceiving that we're in a stressful environment all the time, since humans have these big brains and we can think about things too much, we can literally think our way into a stress response. And we're the only species that can do that. If you scare the crap out of a dog and they have a stress response, they've literally forgotten about it 5 minutes later.
Lucky them.
Yeah, exactly. And we can sit there and think, oh my gosh, what if it happens again? We can stew on that for a month. We could see something bad happen to somebody else, not even like on the news or whatever, not even close to us at all, and think that it may happen to us and be in a fear state, which I think is happening a lot right now.
Absolutely.
And so when we get this chronic low-grade stress response, then it can create an imbalance in our autonomic nervous system, and we can be stuck in what we call fight or flight, or sympathetic, the sympathetic aspect of the nervous system. And we really need a balance between sympathetic and parasympathetic. And parasympathetic is like rest and digest. We're in more of a calm state. And it's never like it's one or the other. And I think that people misinterpret that, and they think that, oh, I'm in sympathetic or I'm in parasympathetic. But in reality, you're always having a balanced signal between the two to whatever cell is having or feeling that effect, And so the problem can be, well, there's a lot of different issues. And so to illustrate how detrimental this could be, I like talking about how an imbalance in our autonomic nervous system can trigger a heart attack. And this is a heart attack that requires absolutely no blockage, because there's very interesting research that shows that a lot of the times people have heart attacks with no blockage whatsoever. and they can't really explain why there's tissue death. And so what happens is we have these three different pillars, I think, that people should pay attention to as far as their health. One is being metabolically flexible, which means that your body has the ability to go back and forth from burning glucose and fatty acids and or ketones readily. It can do both. And to do that, we have to eat in certain ways that create that situation. And that does not include vegetable oils.
Right.
And the other one is we can have high oxidative stress, which we talked about. And that can, those free radicals that have oxidative stress can deplete nitric oxide, which is something that the lining of our arteries make. And it's very important for the signaling of the autonomic nervous system. Okay. And so when we have those two things and we have an imbalanced autonomic nervous system, we can get this situation that doesn't bode well for our hearts. And so our heart's feeling this stress, and it has this connection between, our autonomic nervous system, and it's kind of telling us how we feel emotionally. And let's say we have those three imbalances, and then we get a stressful, event that happens to us. And that could be the death of a loved one. It could be stress at work or prolonged stress at work. There's definitely research that shows that heart attacks are more prevalent on stressful days of the year, like major holidays and Mondays and things like that.
Right.
And so what happens is we get a sudden surge of sympathetic activity, of stress activity to the heart. And we're always supposed to have a kind of a balancing surge of the parasympathetic as well. It's always supposed to be there. However, in heart cells, for that signal, that parasympathetic, that calm signal to be relayed to the heart cells, it requires nitric oxide. And so if we have this high state of oxidative stress that's depleting nitric oxide, or we have damaged arteries, and so those arteries can't make nitric oxide like they're supposed to, then we're impeding that ability of that signal of the parasympathetic to get to the heart cells. And so all of a sudden we have this surge of adrenaline response, of stress response to our heart cells, to a certain group of heart cells or the whole heart or wherever. And that's unchecked by the parasympathetic signal. And when that happens, something similar to what happens in skeletal muscle happens. And so when we go for a run, that's a stressful thing for our skeletal muscles.
Right.
And so they start burning up the glycogen stores, the glucose in the skeletal muscles. And that's what creates lactic acid built up. That's what's the muscle burn when we're working out. We feel muscle burn because we're building up lactic acid.
Right.
And so there's a lot of research that shows that the heart really prefers ketones. And I think that this is why, because it prevents it from ever getting into this state. Unless we have this imbalanced autonomic nervous system, we get that surge of sympathetic, and then the heart cells start burning more glucose. And there's actually studies that show that signal, that sympathetic signal, can actually inhibit inhibit the inhibition of burning glucose in the heart cells. And so when we get that surge, the heart starts burning more glucose. We get a buildup of lactic acid, which is a muscle burn, which we know as angina. People have that chronically, then they're burning too much glucose in their heart cells, I think.
Interesting.
And then that creates, so we get this buildup of lactic acid and hydrogen ions, which is this kind of state of oxidative stress in there, like in a certain specific area of the heart cell or the heart where this is happening. And that creates edema. It creates swelling. And so that does two things. One, it interferes with calcium, and calcium is what our muscles use to contract. Actin and myosin things that they use calcium to contract. So that interferes with the absorption of calcium. So now muscle cells are dysfunctional. But the other thing it does is that you can imagine when we have swelling, the pressure is usually greater coming from the arteries into the cell. But now with this swelling, the pressure is getting more out this way. And so it prevents the blood from getting in. Now we have no oxygen, we have no nutrients, we have ischemia. And so we get a certain area of the heart cells that die. And so, and unless we can reverse that signaling of the autonomic nervous system quick enough, that will continue to happen. And lots of times we do reverse it quick enough and someone survives a heart attack. And this is not to say that a blockage can't happen. But like as far as like a sudden plaque formation, or sudden, not a plaque formation, but an embolism forms, or a
Mm.
plaque breaks off and flows down to a smaller area and blocks things, like that definitely can happen. But there's lots of research. Well, I wouldn't say lots of research, but there's Dr. Giorgio Beraldi, who's a coronary artery pathologist, found that anytime there's a stenosis of an artery, where it gets narrower from atherosclerosis, that he said in 100% of the cases that he did autopsies on, where there was stenosis, there was a vast network of collateral arteries that had grown around it. And so the body's bypassed it already. And I found studies that show that those arteries can form within 4 days. So they
Wow.
form pretty quickly. Yeah, because I've had cardiologists say that there's definitely collaterals. We know that, but they couldn't form quick enough to compensate for a stenosis. And it's like, well, research has shown that they can grow them, like I think in dogs and then in other animals, within 4 days. So there's a lot of things that question this traditional idea of, oh, we get atherosclerosis that slowly builds up and then all of a sudden blocks the artery and we get a heart attack. I don't think that's the case all the time. I think that can be the case, but it also goes to show the importance of these three underlying imbalances that happen: this autonomic nervous system, oxidative stress, and metabolic inflexibility, which is what most of westernized people are plagued with, those three imbalances. And so that's what I think is driving this situation. And I think that once we have those imbalances, it can all be triggered by a stress response from an imbalanced autonomic nervous system.
I see. So you're saying they can work together to some degree,
Yeah,
to trigger a response. It's not just an autonomic response where you have sympathetic hormones and not allowing the nitric oxide to get in and relax things. It's also the lack of metabolic flexibility, where you have increased glucose burning. That would add to the stress. Obviously, that would add to as we mentioned earlier, the oxidative response, or the free radicals being formed when you have much more glycolytic metabolism.
Right.
And then with the sympathetic, you're talking about more. So for sympathetic, for help people understand, cortisol, essentially, more cortisol, more of those kind of hormones, versus in the parasympathetic, we're looking at, well, obviously melatonin is one of the things that helps us sleep. That's a parasympathetic. Serotonin. So help people kind of unpack sympathetic and parasympathetic.
Yeah. So if you think about, well, think about it this way. So if I was, so there's work of a guy named Dr. Robert Sapolsky, and he's a neurobiologist at Stanford, and he studied the stress response in mammals in the wild, and he wrote a book called Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers. And what he found was
great title.
Yeah, what he found was that if there was a zebra like grazing on the savannah, or any animal whatsoever, its cortisol levels were very low. It had no stress response going on, right? And then a cheetah comes out of the bushes and tries to get it, and obviously there's a stress response happening, and cortisol goes up, and then if it gets away, if it happens to be lucky enough to get away, that stress response drops. That cortisol drops within like a few minutes. And so that's not what happens in humans. We can think about that stress and be stressed about that for a long time. But if we take the two different states of that zebra, one, it's in rest and digest, it's in parasympathetic, and its body, it's thinking about things like sleeping or eating and digesting or procreating, or detoxing, all these different things. That's rest and digest. Your body's in that state, so it's going to release hormones and things that create those things, or help that stuff happen. It's going to create digestive hormones and all kinds of things.
And more even healing. Might even say like.
And healing, yeah, definitely.
Okay.
And let's say, and then we look at the zebra running from the cheetah. do you think the zebra's body is saying, hey, let's digest this grass we just ate? Hey, let's go take a nap. No, it's getting away from that zebra. So it's secreting hormones, cortisol, things that, are excitatory and are prepping that zebra or allowing that zebra to get away from the threat.
Mm-hmm.
And so if we get stuck in that state where we're supposed to be, getting away from that threat, our body's secreting things that are preventing us from doing all those rest and digest things. So let's say someone has high stress and they have insomnia.
Mm-hmm.
They're not going to sleep.
Right.
They're having sexual dysfunction. Their body's not detoxing. They're having digestive issues. These are all things that can happen because we get stuck in that stress state. And I think that one of my favorite ways to explain things is evolutionarily. And so when we look at mammals evolved, from reptiles. We split from reptiles around 225 million years ago. And if we look at the stress response in mammals or in reptiles versus mammals, it gives us some insight. So in reptiles, that vagus nerve, the nerve that controls our autonomic nervous system, there's one pathway in it, and it's called the dorsal motor nucleus. And that dorsal motor nucleus is what creates an excitatory response for a stress response. And in a reptile, that can actually, if it's too big or enough of a stress response, it can actually create organ shutdown. So those animals can literally play dead. And you could examine them and think they were dead because they're cold-blooded. And so their metabolism is slow enough that they can literally shut down organs and not die. Now, I still haven't found a good explanation as to why that's evolutionarily advantageous to play dead. But I'm looking for one, but that's what they do. And so they can, drop their oxygen levels. They can drop their metabolism in a way that they can literally seem like they're dead and then come back from that.
They could stay underwater a long time, though. I think it'd be advantageous when that alligator stays submerged.
That's true, yeah.
For long periods of time. Yeah.
And so then when mammals come along, we become warm-blooded. And warm-blooded just means we're very metabolically active. We're always making energy, which creates a warm body.
Right.
And so if we were to have that stress response and shut down an organ, that's not a good thing. Okay.
No.
Right. That's going to lead to tissue death, which sounds like a heart attack.
Right.
And so what happened was we developed these two different pathways in the vagus nerve. It's still one nerve, but it has two different neuronal pathways. And when we have the dorsal motor nucleus, like the reptiles, and we also have a nucleus ambiguous. And so the dorsal motor nucleus is still, is kind of that rest and digest. And then we have this nucleus ambiguous that we evolved to have the stress response and without going into that organ shutdown. So we kind of, this two pathway system that balances each other out. Which is sympathetic, parasympathetic, right?
Right.
And so because that happened, we can have stress responses most of the time and not have a heart attack or not have organ shutdown, because also other organs have infarction too. They have, the liver does, the kidney does. I think pretty much any organ can. It's just that the heart's so connected emotionally and so metabolically different in that it prefers ketones that I think it's more prone to it. But yeah, so it makes a lot of sense in that regard when you look at things evolutionarily. But I don't think that evolution was accounting for the fact that we were going to change our environment so radically that it would result in these imbalances that would kind of override what evolution had done for us as far as preventing a situation where we could have a heart attack. And we're seeing ourselves in those situations, and then we end up with tissue death in our organs.
Yeah.
So,
right.
Yeah.
So some level of stress response is obviously necessary, and we induce them. So exercise, as you mentioned, induces a short-term stress response, a sympathetic response. All those hormones are going, gets our heart rate up, gets our blood pressure up, and it's beneficial in a short-term sense, right? Because we do need some degree of catabolic or breakdown. We need some degree of stress to create adaptation, right? So it's meant in a short term, and then we ideally spend much more time in a parasympathetic or relaxed state, not only when we're sleeping, but in like you said, there's always some level of it, but we want more of the parasympathetic throughout our day. So we're not constantly running. So it sounds like you're describing the person who's feels like they're constantly running late. Like they're always under the gun. They're always under some sort of like, whether it's a physical deadline or their own thought process, they feel like they're constantly, what they're doing isn't good enough, or they're constantly running late, or they're constantly in this state of anxiousness. Right. So that would keep them in a sympathetic state for a good part of their day, or whenever they're letting their mind do that. Not just insomnia, not just affecting their sleep, but affecting their day, I would imagine.
Right. Yeah. It would keep them imbalanced.
Imbalanced, right.
Yeah. So think about it this way. Maybe people will grasp this a little bit. So when we talk about metabolic flexibility, we talk about the cell's ability to burn glucose and fatty acids and or ketones readily. They can go back and forth easily. That's metabolic flexibility. If we eat a diet that always provides excessive carbohydrates, especially processed ones, because whole food carbohydrates aren't evil, but if we eat those processed carbohydrates all the time, then the body's always going to choose those. They're easier to burn, and eventually we lose the ability to make ketones as much and burn fatty acids, and we just kind of downplay or downregulate the mechanisms that our body does that. And so that's why when we restrict carbohydrates, people get the keto flu. They need to adapt to burning fatty acids again. And again, there's nothing wrong with either fuel source. It's how we're eating them, I think. And I think that so when we're metabolically flexible, we're restricting carbohydrates enough, or we're eating only a few of them, so that your body has to make ketones sometimes, and you keep those mechanisms going, right? And so if we ever had a ton of carbohydrates, if we go and eat like a ton of chips or ice cream or whatever, your body goes and burns those carbohydrates, and then it goes right back to burning the fatty acids and ketones. And so it's the same thing with the stress response. Like, we want to be able to go back and forth and have a balance between the two all the time. But if we're chronically thinking that we're overthinking our lives and getting into the stress response, or having a low-grade stress response all the time, it's kind of like we're eating those carbohydrates all the time, and our body forgets how to go into parasympathetic and keep that balancing. And so we get stuck in that. And so then if something really stressful happens, then our body can't balance that with parasympathetic enough, and that's where we can get these bad situations. But it's a balancing act. I think that health is about adaptation. It's the ability of the body to adapt. And so if we do things that take away the body's ability to adapt, like we stay in a stress response and we downregulate the parasympathetic non-stress response, or we eat all of these processed carbs and we downregulate all the mechanisms to burning fatty acids and ketones, we're creating a situation where if we were forced to, it'd be much harder for the body to adapt, right? Where if we do these things, where we eat whole foods, more good fats and carbohydrates, whole food carbohydrates only, in limiting amounts, and then we're also doing things that balance our autonomic nervous system, now we're much more resilient to things that may happen. Like if all of a sudden the only food around was a bunch of carbohydrates, hey, we could burn those. If the only food around was fats, hey, we could burn those too. No big deal. We've maintained metabolic flexibility. And then vice versa. If we have a huge stress response or something really stressful happen to us, our body can handle that because we've got the ability. We've got the parasympathetic there to balance out the sympathetic. But if we're stuck in sympathetic and we've downregulated parasympathetic, and then all of a sudden something really stressful happens to us, and we don't have that balance, then that's when we can get this surge in sympathetic and bad things can happen.
Right.
So it's living your life in a way that allows you to be adaptable. Because if we think about it, if we ask most 16-year-olds to go sprint a lap around a track, they could probably do it. Their body's able to adapt to that stress.
Absolutely.
But you ask the average 80 or 90-year-old to do that, and they may actually die if we force them to do that, because they've gotten to the point and they've lived their life in a way, and their body's just not as good at doing these things, that they can't adapt as well. Not to say that there isn't a 90-year-old that could do that, because there is some that could. and not to say that there's not a 16-year-old that couldn't do that, because these days there are some that have created a situation where they couldn't.
Right.
So yeah, maybe that's a good way of putting things, you know.
Okay. So I know you see people, you're a clinician like me.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you have clients, patients. Uh,
Yeah.
so when you have someone come in or come to you saying, they recognize they're in the sympathetic state through most of the day, um, through just, this, right? Through their head, through
Yeah.
their environment, how they're dealing with their environment, how they're approaching their environment. What do you tell them? What action steps do you give them, or inaction steps do you give them, or how do you help them change that paradigm? Because that may be
Yeah.
all they know how to deal with their life. That's how they've taught themselves to deal with
Exactly.
their environment. So how does someone who's saying, "Hey, this is me," what would be some early steps to start walking towards
Yeah.
unplugging maybe a little bit and getting more parasympathetic?
I think that, so this is one of the most difficult things, you know, um, because it's almost like out of sight, out of mind. It's not something that, you know, people have to eat every day. So
Right.
it's easier to change something that you do every day already, you know, because you're constantly reminded I have to change to do it because you have to eat. Whereas, you know, being stressed out, people are like, oh, I'm stressed, but it's just so hard to take action steps to do things that help you cope with stress. And I think that it's a little bit backwards, that approach too. So one thing I'll say is that I think one of the most useful things, and it sounds funny, but if someone's stressed out about something, I tell them to, well, first of all, it's figuring out what those stressors are that lead to the imbalance. Because you could be like, oh, all these things stress me out. But you can go and do like neurofeedback or track your heart rate variability and figure out what things kind of stress you out more, or kind of get a
Mm,
sense of what things stress you out more, because those are the important things that you want to focus on. And sometimes those are stresses that you can't remove from your life. Maybe it's your kids. Can't get rid of them, you know?
right.
Um, but yeah, so if you figure out those things, um, I tell people that one of the most useful exercises is to take that thing and think about what you're fearful about in that stressful thing in your life, and imagine the worst possible scenario. Like, play it out. What would happen? Just go down this terrible, you know, black hole and be like, what's the worst thing that can happen? And just play out what would you do if that did happen? You know, because then you've thought about it, you know, and you figured out what you would do. And at the end of it, usually people say, well, as much as that would suck, you know, in the end, it's okay. You know, in the end, I'm okay. And even if you die, like, that's obviously the ultimate thing that could go wrong.
Right.
However, you're dead. You're not going to be stressing about that anymore. That's a terrible thing to think about, but I tell people to play that out, because now because lots of times it's a fear of something you don't understand, or a fear of
Sure.
something you don't want to think about. Whereas if you go and you think about it, you almost prepare yourself for when that would happen, hopefully obviously that it doesn't, and doing everything you can to prevent that from happening. But if you go there, if you dare yourself to go there and think about that, then it's kind of preparing. It's like, oh, well, now I know what I would do if that did happen. Hope it doesn't, but now I know what I would do. And most people come to the conclusion that, yeah, it would be okay, because most of the things that people really stress about um, aren't as problematic, I think, as they are making them up to be in their head, right?
Mm, sure.
Um,
A little bit like
the other
carrying a
thing,
mental parachute, maybe. They've got it tacked
yeah,
away. They've kind of walked it out. What would I do? I'd
yeah,
pull the string and that, and that would
right.
be, it would be
I mean,
there. It's,
how many times do you hear someone say like, "God, if that happened, I don't know what I would do."
well,
You
yeah.
know, it's
Yes,
just like,
often.
because you haven't thought about it. Like, think about it,
Yeah.
and then you know, as you know, stressful as it may be to think about it, at least you're preparing yourself, and you feel more able to conquer that if it did. You know,
Hmm.
um,
More prepared.
sometimes people don't like that approach, but I tend to like that. Um,
Okay.
Another one I say is just think about, you know, change your perception of stress. Um, think about, because like I said, most things that we stress about in our modern world, you know, like first world problems, um, think
Right.
about those, change your perspective.
Like they run out of
Um,
toilet paper at the store, that kind of thing.
exactly. Like, think about, change your perspective. Think about
Right.
how someone else may be in that situation every single day, and they're still alive. They're doing fine.
Right.
You
Right.
know, they change. that kind of stuff. Or think about, like, does it really matter if that goes wrong? Because the majority of things we stress about don't. And we just have to, I guess, put a hierarchy in our head of how much we're stressing about things, and does that match up with how important they actually are? And then I think that there are many different ways that people, like to talk about, and they're good things, like being in nature and doing saunas and social relationships and all these different things that can help stimulate parasympathetic and create that balance. But I think that's a little bit of backwards thinking, as far as, because if we're still having all those things that stimulate sympathetic, yes, we're creating more balance with stimulating parasympathetic, but we really need to remove those things that are stimulating sympathetic. It's kind of like saying, I'm going to eat all these processed sugars and vegetable oils. I'm going to continue to eat those, but I'm going to take these really healthy supplements.
Right.
It's just like, that's not going to do anything.
People do that.
Yeah, people actually do that. And so they say, oh, I'm going to do all these things and jam pack my day full of all this parasympathetic stimulating things, but I still have to deal with those sympathetic stimulating things. And sometimes we have to, and that's true. But really we need to look at our lives and figure out what sympathetic things can we get rid of. And so, or even do like some sort of therapy. One of the coolest things I've heard about was from I'm forgetting his name, Robert Cywus, I think his name is, was dopamine fasting. I don't know where he got it from, but basically he's arguing that we're addicted to that dopamine, and that dopamine causes these stress. So every little alert on our phone causes a dopamine surge. Every little thing we eat is a dopamine surge. Every conversation we have with someone is a dopamine surge. And so we're inundated with that all day long, and that creates this constant state of being on alert and stressed,
Right.
And so you take a day, or even if you can't do it for a full day to start out with, you do it for half a day, and you just remove as many of those things as you can, and you don't eat, you don't talk to anybody, you don't have your phone on you, you don't watch anything like movies or anything like that. You don't do anything that you can think of that would stimulate dopamine, and it kind of gives you a reset. Like for me, people are like, well, then what do you do? How do you spend that day? And I usually just go like set up my hammock in the woods and just kind of hang out, and I have like a pen and paper, and I just write what I'm thinking or whatever for that day. And it goes by quicker than you think. But I think that it's a really useful exercise, not just for removing all those things for a while and resetting that stress response, but also for just checking out and
decompressing
on hold for a little. Yeah, for sure. And just especially when I write things down, because it's like I'm getting those things that I need to decompress from out.
Absolutely. Cathartic kind of.
Yeah. So I like those strategies, and they're difficult to do. I mean, not many people could take a Saturday and just do that if they got kids and responsibilities. It's hard to do. But if you can do it, I think it's worth it.
Right. I would explain those chambers people go to, please, do 1 or 2 hours of no, they're in darkness or floating in water. I'm talking about they just
still water flotation things.
Yeah. There's no stimulation whatsoever. And just to let the body completely decompress and just no stimulation at all. I could see how that would really just calm everything down. Now you still have to learn how to deal with the stressors in your day, but as an acute therapy, that could be very beneficial if you're trying to ratchet things down. But like you said, you've got to learn how to deal with, like, play out those situations, or learn to manage your responsibilities, learn to manage your stress in a way that, or the things you have to walk out, I shouldn't say stress, in a way that is not stressful, or in a way that is less stressful, or that does not overstimulate. So it is very much it's not a flip of the switch. It's a new discipline, really.
Right.
And a new way of thinking for people, but very necessary. Well, awesome. Thank you. So I guess a lot of people would not consider that to be a trigger for, we can say stress, we can hear, oh yeah, stress does that, but it doesn't really get addressed into how does that work? What are the mechanisms? And so that's great that you unpack that, because it does make sense that they would all sort of play together with, as you mentioned, the toxins and the dietary, the glycolytic overwhelm, as you say, with lactic acid and so forth.
Right.
Awesome. So this is what's you unpack in your book that you're editing right now. Is that correct?
Yeah. So that, and I mean, that's a big part of it. I mean, I kind of, trace heart disease from, billions of years ago, because I think the process, or that what causes it today, started billions of years ago. I think that I've also found that the heart is not a pressure propulsion pump. That's not its function in the body. And the blood moves by other means, largely by other means. So yeah, there's a lot that I've gone through. I just kind of laid it all out, and hopefully people like it.
Interesting. What's the book? Do you have a title?
Right now, I made a change, but right now the title is Understanding the Heart: Uncommon Insights into Our Most Commonly Diseased Organ.
Oh, okay, great. Well, you'll have to, I'm going to link to in the show notes, link to your website, so at least people can follow up, and you'll find it there. Information will be published there as well, as well as your other social media sites.
Yeah, just so people know, there is a small ebook on the website now that's not this full book that I'm writing, but it's one I just wrote. It's maybe like 20 or 30 pages or something like that. It's about the heart, but it's not the one, just so people don't get confused or whatever.
Okay, what's that one called?
That one's called The Heart: Our Most Medically Misunderstood Organ.
Wow. Interesting. Well, so when your book comes out, when you get it finished, you have to come back and tell us, kind of help unpack some of that, because it sounds like what you just told me right now is another topic of discussion, where it's describing the heart as a non, I can't even repeat what you just said, but basically it is not the primary pump of, it's not the primary pump of the body for blood.
Yes, it's not the primary mover of the blood, right?
The primary mover of the blood.
Yeah. And it's in that position where it is, and it does what it does for a very different reason than moving blood. But yeah, that's I'd love to come back on, and we can talk about that whenever the book's ready.
Absolutely. We should definitely do it when the book's ready, though, so that way it makes sense for people to go out and grab it and get more information on it. So awesome. Well, thank you, Stephen. I appreciate your time coming here. Like I said, I'm going to link to all your social media. I know you're on Instagram and Facebook, Twitter as well.
Twitter a little bit, yeah. I'm on there a little bit. So
yeah, I'm not a big fan of Twitter myself. I'm just like that's like, I like pictures. But so Instagram, Facebook, your website, so it'll be available there, and I'll link out to that. And like I said, in the show notes. Thank you again. This has been really eye-opening for people. I know, just because, as we mentioned, it's not just there's so much focus is on LDL, saturated fat. Oh, what should I be eating? And not that the food is not important, but it's just not the only factor. Yeah. It's not the only factor. And really our stress and our sympathetic and parasympathetic state is really underestimated and undervalued when it comes to our health, especially in the Western world, I would say, and with the US being with a big fat star on it for that, with stress. I mean, we basically brag about it. We brag about working and not needing sleep. We brag, which has a huge effect on cortisol and elevating insulin levels. We brag about the grind. That's like the thing. That's like, I'm stressing, I'm pounding. And yeah, there's a great work ethic is a fabulous thing, but there's a way to work without sacrificing your long-term health in a way that it's just not, you shouldn't have to wear it as a badge of honor that you are taxing yourself emotionally and physically to a point of an early grave, essentially.
Exactly. We need to find this balance.
Yes, we need to find if you want to call it balance, and a balance is, I think, it's not one place. It's mobile. It's kind of like it's a giving and taking. As you mentioned, we have to go there, and then we need to come back. And we have to
Exactly.
go into stress, and
We
we
need
have to come back.
we need to be in a state or
Flexible.
live our lives in a way that allows us to come back. We can have those situations and they don't affect us negatively, or they don't affect us so negatively that something, you know, affects our life or even kills us. You know, we need to be able to have those and bounce back from them easily.
Exactly. Exactly. Awesome. Well, Stephen, thank you again. I appreciate your time so much, and I'm looking forward to this book.
Yeah. Thanks for having
That's
me.
great.
It's been a pleasure.